Hi, Susan here. Okay, let's talk about the bias grain. How do we find the bias grain? How do we make bias strips? And how do we cut a pattern on the bias? And that's what's next. Guys, so before we get started, my name is Susan, and if you're just tuning in for the first time, I hope you're going to love this. I teach everything. I'm a fashion designer and instructor, and I teach everything about fashion design and the industry itself with how-tos, demonstrations, making garments, and interviews. So I hope that you will tune in and subscribe and give this a like if you like this video and share it. So let's talk about the bias. So bias is the third grain line that is important to fashion designers. We have the lengthwise grain, we have the crosswise grain, and then there's the true bias, a directional grain line. So we need to talk about that. And how do we find that in fashion design? How do we find that with our ruler? How do we make it, make strips so that you can cut some bias strips? And how do we cut an actual pattern piece on the bias? Okay, let me show you that on the flat now. I thought I would start this demonstration with some pattern pieces. These are actually my sloper blocks. This is the back sloper block, and this is the front sloper block. And I wanted to show you first the directional grain lines. We already have the lengthwise grain put in and the crosswise grain put in the back bodice. And that is simply just putting a parallel line to the straight edge of the back sloper and drawing a 2-inch line, 2-inch over straight line. That becomes the lengthwise grain. And then when you do a perpendicular grain to the actual lengthwise grain using your 2-inch by 18-inch clear plastic ruler, I'm going to put this line actually on one of the heavier lines of the ruler itself. And then what you do is you draw a perpendicular line this way. That becomes the crosswise grain. And the true bias is the 45-degree angle from the lengthwise grain and the crosswise grain. And the best way to do that is to take your clear plastic ruler and you can take a 2-inch block of your ruler and put the center of a 2-inch block in the center of that, the lengthwise grain and the crosswise grain. You see how that's there and here, and then put a dot on one angle or one corner to another corner, just like that. And when you do that, you've got 3 points to make a line. You've got a dot, the center point, and another dot. And once you draw that in, you will have your 45-degree angle and your true bias. And that's how you get the 45-degree angle here from the lengthwise grain and the crosswise grain. Let's do that again. Here is the front bodice. I'm going to put the grain line on this is the center front. We've got the lengthwise grain, which is parallel to the center front. I'm going to draw a line, and that is the lengthwise grain. Now I need to get the crosswise grain, and that would be perpendicular to the lengthwise grain. I'm going to take my ruler and take the heavy line, take the line on one of the heavier markings of my ruler like that, clear plastic ruler, and draw a perpendicular line that way. And when I do that, this becomes the crosswise grain. And then to get the true bias, I'm going to take my 2-inch block of my clear plastic ruler. I'm going to put it in the center of that intersection here of the lengthwise grain and crosswise grain. Put it there on the center. Put a dot on either side, a dot that way and a dot this way. So now you have the 3 points, and I'm going to connect those 3 points like that. And you now have the bias. This is called the bias or true bias. The reason why it's a true bias is because it's an actual 45-degree angle from the lengthwise grain and the crosswise grain. Now that we understand that on the pattern, let's work on the fabric and cut some bias strips. I wanted to show you this demo with a torn piece of muslin. I have it folded in half. This is the crosswise grain or the torn edge, and this is the lengthwise grain or the salvage. So the lengthwise grain goes this way, parallel to the salvage all the way along the fabric. The crosswise grain or the weft goes perpendicular, or where this torn edge is, all the way down the fabric like this. To find the true bias, it is a 45-degree angle. So I'm going to take my pattern block and I'm going to show you. What you have to do if you're going to be cutting this is you have to make sure that the salvage is parallel to the grain line that you choose to cut the pattern in. So if I want to make it lengthwise, I'm going to have to make the lengthwise grain parallel to the salvage as I'm cutting it like this, and making sure that it's equally parallel this way. And then I can go ahead and weigh this down and cut this pattern piece. If I want to cut this pattern piece on the crosswise part of the grain, I would have to turn the pattern this way and then make it parallel to the salvage this way. And that would determine that this pattern block will be cut on the crosswise of the grain line, if that makes sense. If you want to do the bias, which is what we're going to be doing today, you have to put this bias directional grain line. It has to be parallel to your salvage, making the pattern look a little bit funny. It's on an angle like this. But you would have to take the bias grain line, directional grain line, and you're going to have to make it parallel to the salvage itself. So I would have to measure with my tape measure and make sure that this pattern block is parallel to the salvage itself. And when I do that, I'm just going to show you. I'm going to trace it out so you can see what it looks like. Okay, when I take that off, as you can see, the pattern piece is not straight up and down. It is not crosswise at all. It is on a weird kind of angle. This is the bias of the actual fabric that this pattern piece is made on. In order to see that, I want to pull a grain and show you. When I pull a grain, you can actually physically see that grain line. This is grain line like that, if that makes sense. So this pattern piece, if you cut it like this all the way around, this actual bodice piece will be cut on the bias, giving it a softer and more closely fitted and kind of stretchier portion of the fabric. Because, just so you know, the lengthwise grain usually on a woven fabric doesn't give at all. The crosswise grain or cross of it may give just slightly when you have an actual woven fabric. But when you're actually working on the bias, tons and tons of what we call mechanical stretch or give. That's another reason why people like it on the bias. Let's make some bias strips. The bias strips will have the same type of effect. I'm going to go ahead and take my ruler. I'm going to pull a grain just so it's easy for you to see. I'm going to pull a lengthwise grain. So that is my lengthwise grain because the pin usually wants to go in there. And then I'm going to put a perpendicular line with my ruler to find my crosswise grain like that. Then I'm going to find the true bias, putting the center or the intersection in a 2-inch block on my ruler itself like this. Put a dot and a dot on opposite corners. Draw a line like that through all 3 points. And now you have the true bias. If you want to make bias strips, you can then just take your ruler. Let's say I want to make an inch bias strip. I'm going to put that line on the center line because this is a 2-inch ruler, and I'm going to just draw a line, and I have a 1-inch bias strip. If I want to make more strips, I continue that process all the way along the fabric like that till I get the desired amount of bias strips that I want. If you don't want to draw on your fabric itself, you can put a piece of paper on top of it, draw your perfect line, and then go ahead and cut it. But I just wanted to show you on the fabric itself, and that's how you get it. So let's go ahead and just cut this out so you can see. When I cut here like that, I'm able to make true bias strips for cleaning, finishing, making your own piping, making your own bias tape, whatever you need it to be. So there's your true bias with the fabric, and then cutting out the actual piece. Okay, so here's your bias strip, and here is your bias pattern. As you can see now, it's going to be a softer, more flexible garment because you cut it on the bias. And that's one of the main reasons why people want to cut something on the bias. It gives it a softer, more closely fitted, because the bias grain will tend to come closer to the body than the lengthwise and especially the crosswise, if that makes sense. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. Give it a thumbs up. Share this video with your friends who are struggling with bias, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.